My name is Zainab Sailgan. I am the Muslim scholar here at ICGS, and we build learning communities where religious difference becomes a powerful force for good. That's why we are proud to host programs like this that help us understand the complexities of religion and the ways in which we can confront religious intolerance through education and dialogue. Just before we jump into today's discussion with Arthur Magida around his newest book, Name Madeleine, a Sufi Spy in Nazi-occupied Paris. And if you haven't purchased the book already, that's it. We will drop a link into the chat. So make sure to, if you want to buy it as a gift for the upcoming holidays, Hanukkah, Christmas, and Arthur has actually also this wonderful offer that if you get in touch with him, you will receive an autograph, and you can also put that in in that book and share it with your family and friends. So I wanted to provide a quick review of the platform for today's discussion. I mean, the structure for the hour. So we'll be in a webinar format, and we will start with about 30 minutes of discussion, and then I will turn to the audience questions for our guests. So throughout, please feel free to drop questions in the Q&A window at any point during our conversation, and my amazing team here at ICGS will be collating those. You may also upload other questions to help us in prioritizing questions of particular interest to this audience and to save you from submitting a similar question. So let me just make a formal introduction. Arthur Magida is a resident of Baltimore. He's former senior editor of the Baltimore Jewish Times and longtime friend of ICGS. His books, which invariably address religious and or spiritual issues, include The Rabbi and The Hitman, The Nazi Seance, and How to Be a Perfect Stranger, A Guide to Etiquette in Other People's Religious Ceremonies. Two of his books, in fact, have been optioned for films. And we just, on that front, congratulations, Arthur. This is amazing news. He is an award-winning journalist and former professor at Georgetown University and the University of Baltimore. He has been a consultant for several PBS documentaries and to the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, as well as a columnist for BeliefNet.com. He is a contributing correspondent to PBS Religion and Ethics Newsweekly and editorial director of Jewish Lights Publishing. So it's my great pleasure to welcome Arthur, and thank you for doing this with us today. And I also want to just mention that in this moment, I hope you all are safe and healthy. I know it's a challenging time for everyone in unique ways, and we all keep you in our thoughts and hope that you continue to be well in these extraordinary times. So let me just say, Arthur, as a Muslim growing up in Germany and who engaged with the Holocaust in literally every history class, I wish I would have been introduced to Noor much, much earlier in my life. I think her example of selflessness and sacrifice is truly inspiring. And I think you, as someone who spent so much time writing about her and talking about her, would you describe in your own words who she was and why are you so passionate in sharing her story?
Sure, certainly, Zainab. But first of all, thank you very much, ICJS. You said I'm a long-standing friend of the Institute. The Institute is a long-standing friend of me. It has helped me in many ways. It has provided insights into my own faith, into my own faiths, because on certain days I believe I have many, sometimes too many. Like Whitman, I contain multitudes. But the Institute has also provided a forum for events like this, but we'll get away from me and from Noor just for a moment. It's provided forums for people from many paths to come together, many people who would never encounter each other in any other way except for the Institute. And in our nation at this time, such a service is invaluable. So I thank you very much. And for all those who are listening and viewing, may I remind you, Today is Tuesday Giving. Give to the Institute for Christian Jewish Studies. Easier for me to say that than you. And when you're done with that, buy my book. Who is Noor, you asked? And you regret that Noor had not come into your life earlier, being a Muslim growing up in Germany. Being a non-Muslim growing up in the United States, I regret that Noor did not come into my life earlier because, like you, I have found her to be an extraordinary person, um, enormously, inordinately generous, sensitive to others, sensitive to herself, concerned about the world, and concerned about how she could devote herself to it. Noor Inayat Khan, to give her her full name, and actually let's expand that for a moment. Her fullest name was Noor Inayat Khan, and Noor means light among women, and indeed Noor was a light, not just among women, but among humanity.
Mhm.
Um, Noor was the daughter of Hazrat Inayat Khan, and he was a native of India. He came to the United States and to the West in 1910. This is Noors Father,
Mhm.
quite an impressive person. He came to the West in 1910, partly to perform with his brothers, because they were all wonderful musicians. But also, very soon, he was teaching about Sufism to Westerners, traveled throughout the United States. Just before he left, he met the woman who would soon become his wife and indeed Noor's mother. That's Ora Baker. They met in New York City, and she eloped, as women tend to do sometimes when they find the man of their love. They got married in Europe. They went off through other European cities. Noor was born, in fact, in Moscow, January 1st, 1914. Here she is with her father. Her birthday is coming up a month from today. Please celebrate it. And eventually they found their way first back to England, then to France after the war. They settled in this house directly opposite Paris in a small suburb called Suresnes, Suresnes. As Hazrat Inayat's fame grew, he would continue to travel throughout the United States, throughout Europe. They had summer school at this large house. And Noor was raised as a Sufi. She was raised in this spiritual environment. She absorbed spiritual teachings and the presence of her father, who was indeed revered in many, many circles um, as an essential spiritual teacher for the 20th century. He was quite profound. He was very poetic in his own writings and his teachings. He died in 1927. Noor was heartbroken. Her mother, I showed a photo of her a moment ago, was also heartbroken. Noor, in a sense, became the mother for her three siblings because her mother could barely take care of them. She was engaged for 6 years during the 1930s to a nice Jewish fellow, Eli, to prove to the family that he was serious about Noor and serious about Sufism. He changed his name to Azim, Azeem, and became a practicing Sufi. All this time, Noor is writing beautiful poetry. She's publishing children's stories. She's a wonderful musician, and she's studying with some of the finest music teachers of the 20th century. 1939, war breaks out between France, Germany. Noor and her brother have an important discussion in this home back in Suresnes. Will they stay? Should they leave? If they stay and they take care of other people, say of Jews, they might hide in a back room, and a German came and asked if they were hiding anybody, would they be complicit if they surrendered that person? They agreed they would be. Meantime, as they're having this discussion, the Germans are bombing, literally bombing their city of Suren. Black smoke is everywhere. Noor and her brother and her sister and other brother leave Suren in her oldest brother's automobile, an MG, a British sports car. When I learned that, I was completely stumped. I know something about sports cars. This made no sense. Sports cars are supposed to have 2 seats. It's impossible to get 4 people into a two-seater MG. Yeah,
That's challenging, right?
right. And in fact, I have a two-seater. I learned that for a couple of years, the MG Auto Company was making MGs 2 seats up front, a rumble seat at the back. So Vilayat, Noor's older brother, drove the car. Noor's mother, Aura, was a passenger up front, and Noor and her sister, Claire, were in the rumble seat in the back. And I'm going to read for a moment from my book. I write that an MG was a great car for a jolly picnic in the country, not for fleeing from the Nazis. An open-air sports car, MGs were made for auto aficionados and for car rallies and for flirting with girls in Piccadilly or at Ascot. They weren't intended for joining a long line of refugees who were escaping to the coast while the Germans strafed from the air. Soon after leaving Suren, Noor's brother turned the car onto roads filled with broken down cars and broken down people. With infantrymen humiliated by their rout and horses lying in ditches, and thousands of people on bicycles weaving in and out of the rubble, and farm wagons piled high with tables and chairs, and suitcases, and a grandmother being pushed in a wheelbarrow. There was a man carrying a cat, a woman carrying a bird in a cage, mothers pushing babies in prams, children carrying toys, dolls, blankies, and everyone, it seemed, was carrying pots, pans, and suitcases. Cars overheated, crept along, mattresses were lashed to the top of the Renaults and Citroens and Mercedes. On top of one car, the body of a grandmother who had died en route was tied to a mattress. Her son could not bear to leave her alongside the road. So this is what Noor witnessed from the jump seat. I'm sure she was eye to eye with these tens of thousands, maybe millions of people who are fleeing the Germans. Finally, they get to a town, Tours, and boarded a train. Noor wrote, the train was noisy, crowded with frantic young mothers with tear-stained eyes, carrying their sleeping youngsters. They knew not where they were heading, just running toward freedom if freedom was to be found. For the little ones, Noor wrote, France should be saved from enemy hands at any price. I have wiped the eyes of some, Noor wrote, given water to others. The distress of a human being is impressive, but the distress of a whole nation, those whose hearts have not beaten and suffered with this cannot know what it means. Well, the family reached the coast. They boarded a ship to England. They found safety. They found ways to contribute to the war effort. Late 1942, Noor was recruited by a secret agency, the SOE, to be an agent for them in France. Basically, the SOE did sabotage against the Germans. June 1943, Noor was flown back into France. A week after that, basically her entire organization was caught by the Germans. There was only one person in this cell still functioning, Noor Inayat Khan. For months, she was the SOE's only radio contact with the resistance and with a few other SOE agents left in France. She sent crucial messages back to London. She was finally caught October 43. She tried to escape a few hours later. About 6 weeks later, she tried to escape again. This is from a Gestapo prison, literally in the center of Paris. This time, the Germans sent her to a brutal German prison. They'd had their fill of Noor in Paris. For 10 months, she was chained, foot to foot, wrist to wrist, and in solitary, and almost starved in a prison in Pforzheim, Germany. And finally, mid-September, she and 3 other women who were at this prison boarded a train, and the next day they were killed at Dachau. That's Noor's story, very, very succinctly.
Thank you. I just think she has such an incredible profile and such a unique persona. I mean, you see, she has all these like different, that example of courage. And I think what I found incredible about her story is, especially, being an agent, she was not really the best at it. She was at times inexperienced and careless. But personally, I think that was also the best about her. She was extremely resilient and full of courage. And she, I think, tells us you don't have to be the best in or perfect to be a hero. I think all what you need to do is really commit it, and you can definitely make a meaningful contribution without being perfect. So how do you explain that, at times when she was sloppy and, the people who trained her, uh, testifying that she is not the best in this role, but she keeps on going. She's very persistent, and she definitely doesn't want to give up on that mission.
No, and let's go back to her training. The SOE trained these agents anywhere 3 to 4 months. They had different facilities throughout the British countryside, the Scottish countryside, and there was one trainer who just could not see Noor fulfilling this role in France. He wrote to his superiors back in London, "Do not send Noor anywhere. This woman is not." Excuse me, it's so ridiculous. He wrote, she's not overburdened with brains. Noor had more than her fill of brains, probably more than the trainer who wrote that about her. And when Noor was in France, she was more than sufficient with courage and discipline and persistence. And in fact, as I write somewhere in the book, the average SOE radio operator in France lasted 6 weeks before the Germans caught them. Noor lasted 4 months. And yet you have the chutzpah and the audacity to say, maybe Noor wasn't right. I've had the same conversation with other people. They often say, Noor wasn't right for this. And I say, yes, she was right for this. 1, she held out more than anybody else. 2, she had such a command of herself and of her mission and of her discipline and why she was there and how she should and could comport herself. And it all goes back to how she was raised. Her father, by the way, in 1927, just before he died, had written a series of codes, chivalrous codes for people to be Sufi knights. And some of these, I'm sure, influenced Noor while she was in France, 1943, even when she was in prison shortly after that. He wrote, "Bear no malice against your worst enemy." How? In France, 1943, as the Nazis are occupying your country, as you have just flown over from England to somehow defeat your worst enemy, can you not bear malice against them? I couldn't, nor could. That defies my very, very feeble imagination. Noors Father also wrote in this list of creeds for knights, do not neglect those who depend upon you. She knew people were depending upon her. She was offered at least 2 airplane rides back to France, back to England, after her cell was devastated. She refused both opportunities. She could have flown back to safety. She
Mm.
stayed in Paris because she knew people were depending upon her. Her father taught truth is all the religion there is. Truth to her was paramount. Truth, he said, is religion. She was being devout. She was being faithful. She was determined to conduct herself with as much integrity as anybody could when pitted against the Germans, when pitted against the Gestapo, because we know those people had no integrity, and yet Noor Inayat Khan did.
Mhm.
On her devotion to truth, when she went up again before a board for a commission, just before the SOE recruited her, they asked her about her regard for Gandhi, because at that point Gandhi was leading different campaigns against the British in India. And she said, you know, she sympathized with Gandhi very much. She hoped he succeeded. But right now, her main concern is defeating the Germans.
Right.
She knew that was going to get her into a lot of trouble, and it did, in fact, but she was being honest because that's the way Noor had to be. By saying she sympathized with Gandhi, members of this board could very well have said she is unreliable, she is against the empire.
Mhm.
She was pro
Mhm.
Gandhi, she was also anti Nazi. And when she was caught the second time after escaping from that Gestapo prison in Paris, she was given a choice. She could remain there if she promised not to escape ever again. This was her second attempt. And it was a pretty comfortable Gestapo prison, if indeed those could be combined in the same sentence. Nor, though, knowing she could never lie about anything, could not take that
That's
vow.
one of her greatest struggles, right? Like throughout the book, you see that is something that is presents a struggle for her because she's so infused with the virtues and teachings of Sufism that lying as an agent seems to be really one of the main things that are really challenging for her.
Right. And what's staggering and impressive and extraordinarily difficult to grapple with is this secret agent not being able to lie about
Mhm.
anything. If you're a secret agent, if you're a spy and you have a code name, and every day you're sending messages back to England, and every day you pick up written messages in drop boxes around France, you have to lie to survive. Nor
Mhm.
never lied. She was
Impressive.
so elusive, so adept at what she did. Don't you dare say she was not cut out to be a spy.
I want to stay a little bit with the whole notion of Sufism because that's something that early on you really spent significant time in the book, and actually throughout the book, you really explain how she was guided by the teachings and virtues of Sufism, how that really was such a core ingredient to her whole to the whole enterprise. And I think in an earlier conversation, you also mentioned that some readers actually found the focus on Sufism a bit off-putting, which I don't agree with because I think that's really a strength of your book. But could you explain to our audience what Sufism is and why do you stress it so much? Because as a Muslim, I was kind of, I found it interesting that you never named her as a Muslim, but you really stressed that she was a Sufi.
Okay, I will first attempt to define Sufism. Uh, um, the consensus is that Sufism is Islamic mysticism. It's the mystical strain of Islam. And it arose 1, 2 centuries after the Prophet Muhammad gave his initial teachings because Islam, excuse me, was beginning to get a little bit too rigid, a little bit too stratified, a little bit
Right.
codified.
That's, yeah.
So
Mhm.
Sufism arose as a way for people to actually experience God, experience the
Mhm.
divinity, if you will, return to some of the initial teachings of the Prophet Muhammad. There are various schools of Sufism, just as there are various schools of all kinds of mysticisms. The school that Noor Inayat Khan's father belonged to and represented in the West is called Chishti, Chisti Sufism. Um, they're very fond of music, of poetry. He excelled at both, as did Noor. They were also very fond of being in this world, as Noors Father emphasized over and over again. He taught true spirituality is being of service to those next to you. And to me, that corresponds to the Jewish notion of tikkun olam, of helping others, of helping this world, not the
Mhm.
next world, not distancing yourself from the world, not meditating on a mountaintop, not going to a yoga center and enjoying the smell of fresh incense and completely zoning out during relaxation. It's being here, not there, here. And that, I believe, is another insight into how Noor conducted herself when she was in France and her determination to get over to France. She could have stayed in England if she wished. She wanted to get back to France. She thought she could serve humanity better in France than she
Mhm.
could in England. So Sufism is Islamic mysticism. The school that Hazrat and I came out of, the Shishti school, is actually so porous that it would accept members who were not Muslim. So a
Mhm.
minority of Christians are not Muslims. In the United States, the school of Islam that Hazrat and I had founded initially made many modifications. So it would be more amenable to Westerners, incorporated a lot of um, other beliefs and other texts from other religions, especially Judaism, Christianity, Hinduism, Buddhism. And it was beginning to move away from Islam. A number of Islamic elements within that strain began to erode in the last few years. More Islamic teachings and traditions have been introduced. So we've seen that particular school in the West wean itself away from Islam and more recently uh, integrate other elements of Islam that had
Mhm.
disappeared over the years. So it's quite a phenomenon to watch. And on Islam's, excuse me, on Sufism's origins, as I said, most people and scholars say it originated a couple of centuries after the Prophet Muhammad. There is a smaller slice of Sufis who say it dates all the way back to Adam, because Adam was the first Sufi. And in a
Mhm.
sense, that makes sense. This is called the transhistorical notion of Sufism. Some Muslims believe that Adam was the first prophet. If indeed he was the first prophet, and of course there were many, many after that, and the prophet Muhammad was the last and the seal of all prophets, then Adam, the prophet Adam, was the first Sufi. But that comes from a minority strain of
Mhm.
Sufis. So I've dealt with many mysticisms and many spiritualities, and it's exciting to watch how they develop and how they respond to different developments outside of them and within them.
Right. No, I think as a Muslim scholar, I think your assessment was, I mean, fair. And Sufism really has this Sufism itself is so diverse, but I think it definitely represents the core teachings of Islam, which is about selflessness and,
Mhm.
the virtues you've mentioned throughout the book, and oftentimes perceived as this element outside mainstream Islam. But really, for the majority of Muslims, it has been really central in the development of Islam, and really also trying to provide that balance where sometimes people get rigid about rules and
Uh-huh.
rituals and saying, oh, okay, what's the spirit, to use a question, what's the spirit of the law instead of
Right.
the letter of the law? As we are continuing our conversation, please make sure to drop in your questions. We are going to address them in a moment. So we'll definitely want to hear from you. So make sure that you get a chance to ask your questions, and the chat is open.
Yeah,
And you
and
already,
and
yes, please go ahead.
if I may, on this quote, tension between Islam and Sufism, and one representing, and I'm saying this very facetiously, and I hope not irreverently, but one representing, let's say, the spirit and the truth of Islam, and the other, the more rigidified manner of the faith. Um, most of us are familiar with the five pillars of Islam. And you can do any one of those, I would imagine, not being a
Mhm.
Muslim. You can do any one of those without feeling the spirit. Yes, you can pray 5 times a day. Yes, you can give to charity. Yes, you can probably even go to Mecca for your once in a lifetime pilgrimage. But unless you sense the divinity and the strength of that moment, unless it transforms you, as I believe Sufism does, then there's a certain vacuity to it and an
Mhm.
emptiness that perhaps Sufism responded to a few centuries after the Prophet Muhammad presented his teachings to the world.
Right.
Um,
So
so,
let's take a question from the audience. So one of our guests is asking, how did you discover Noor's story, and what motivated you to write about her life?
thank you very much. That's an excellent question. Um, I discovered Noor, or she discovered me, very unexpectedly and very innocently on both our parts. Some friends of mine produce documentaries, maybe around 2013, 2014 or so. I got an email from them about their upcoming documentary. It was about to be on PBS, something called Enemy of the Reich. You can still watch it on
Mhm.
Amazon streaming. Um, and it was about somebody I never heard of before, Noor Inayat Khan. Her name is in the first paragraph. This agency that she worked for and sent her off to France, 1943, was also in the first paragraph. The SOE, Special Operations Executive. I'd also never heard of that before. So I
Mm.
was puzzled. What is this, and why are they sending this to me? And why did they make this movie, and why did PBS fund it? Second paragraph mentioned Noor's father, Hazrat Inayat Khan. At that point, I was hooked. For the daughter of Hazrat Inayat Khan, who I was very familiar with, to become a secret agent for the British in 1943 against the Nazis made no sense to me, but I wanted it to make sense to me. And she also, just on a quick read, she also represented and embodied for me what I call spirituality in action. It's not a spirituality that asks you to sit on a zafu, a meditation pillow, and blot out the world. Her spirituality required her to be in the world. So even before I finished reading what they sent me, I arranged to have a screening of this film at the University of Baltimore, where I was then teaching. About 300 people showed up. And we had a panel afterwards with a Holocaust scholar and a Muslim scholar and one of the producers of the film. To prepare for moderating that panel, I needed to learn more about Noor. And the more I read, the more I concluded that a good book about Noor had yet to be written. I, at that point, had written maybe 6 books, 7 books, and I was determined to write a good and fulfilling book about Noor. And one of my great reservations about the previous books about Noor was that none of them grounded Noor in her Sufism. I learned nothing about Sufism from that.
Mm-hmm.
And while writing my book, a very good friend of mine, a Sufi in Germany, sent me the Hazrat Inayat Khan's code regarding nights. And that explains so much to me about Noor. Without these precepts, you know, bear no malice against your worst enemy. Noor's behavior made little sense. With these nightly precepts, they made extraordinary sense.
Mm-hmm.
So that's how I discovered Noor. And if I may, just a second, shortly after I decided to write a book about Noor, I emailed Noor's nephew, who heads the Sufi order in the United States, arranged to interview with him. Um, a week or two before I went up to New York State for the interview. I emailed if he knew of any Sufi teachings or any teachings that may have helped Noor while she was a prisoner for 10 months in this German prison. He sent me a verse from the Bhagavad Gita. And it was a nice translation, but I reached over my shelf. I picked up my own copy of the Bhagavad Gita, finally found the same verse.
Mm-hmm.
And what I found very strange was I had not opened my Bhagavad Gita for 20 or 30 years. 20 or 30 years ago, I had put brackets around one verse in this entire book. And it was the same verse that he had sent me. So I took this with me to the abode of the message in upstate New York. Halfway through the interview, I pulled it out of my backpack, found the page. I thought Pirzia would get a bit of a kick out of it. Suddenly I realized I hadn't put brackets around it, only I had written in the margin, karma yoga, which is what this verse is about, helping others. Karma yoga equals liberty. Then I handed it to him. And he almost shrugged and said, well, of course, because Noor's last word at Dachau was liberty.
Mm-hmm. Wow. I
The,
mean, what you said earlier about that she was a Sufi, being in the world, being involved with the world, uh, but at the same time being detached with your heart from the world. I think that resonates a lot with me, because it's easy and in a way also very egotistic if you just like seek out your own comfort, sit in the cave and do your meditation and your spiritual exercises. But to be in the world with your whole being, but at the same time having this healthy detachment and living out your spirituality in this way, I think Noor is a wonderful example in that regard. And the
yes.
documentary you mentioned, I checked a while ago. People can also watch it on YouTube. It's available, and Unity
Okay.
Productions has some good pieces. So make sure
Yes.
to use them and
Mm.
watch them. So we have another question by one of our teaching fellows, actually, Eleni. She's asking, you've mentioned spiritual teachings of Sufism. Could you expand a bit more on the practices of Sufism and how this may have looked like in Noor's life?
Certainly, and thank you very much. And again, there are a variety of schools and orders of Sufism, so there are a variety of practices. Probably for most Westerners, the most visible practice is whirling.
Mm-hmm. The dervishes from the Mevlevi order.
Yes, and in fact, several years ago, I was in Khartoum in the Sudan, and somebody at my hotel said, "Oh, you want to go see some dervishes?" And we went off, and in the field there were Sufis whirling, and yes, to me that's all that Sufism was about. And you whirl and you whirl and you transport yourself into a different dimension. However, there are also other aspects of Sufism and other disciplines. Studying the text, And in the case of the order in the United States, studying many texts, which is why Pirzia sent me this verse in the Bhagavad Gita. Um, Meditating. I have been to Sufi meditation centers and Sufi retreat centers. They practice, frankly, a form of meditation that I have never seen before. And instead of whirling your entire body, in a sense, you whirl your head and you
Mm-hmm.
go in different directions and you focus on different
Mm-hmm.
sensations as you're whirling.
It's kind of an ecstatic moment because you lose yourself in these remembrances and special supplications, and it's mostly also in a group setting.
Yeah, these are all done within groups.
Hmm.
Also, this was at the abode of the message in upstate New York, which Noor's brother Vilayat founded in the early 70s, actually on the site of an old Shaker village. So it was wonderful to have these two traditions emerge. Um, Almost everything there is done communally. At one point, though, he made a little retreat, solo retreat center for him on a mountaintop above the village, and that's where he would go for his silence and for his solace. Because as with his father, Hazrat Inayat Khan, constantly people were asking for advice and for guidance, and it must be difficult to be a spiritual leader with little time to address your own spirituality.
Hmm.
So to answer in a nugget, there are many Sufi disciplines, many Sufi practices, everything from writing poetry, reading poetry. Rumi, in fact, was a Sufi. Many
Hmm.
people are not aware of that. Um, Writing music, composing, writing music, and Noor, her father, as I said before, are wonderful musicians, and at a lot of Sufi gatherings, there is music and it's luscious. Um, but also one paramount belief is being here, not retreating elsewhere. And that I find extraordinarily powerful and enriching because it does not separate us from others or from what is around us. As I said before, Noors Father said true spirituality is being of service to those on either side of us. You cannot be spiritual without acknowledging those
Hmm.
on both sides of us. It's a matter not of being there, but of being here.
Right. And I think just like to use the word Islam, shocker, but I think faith in action, right? I think that
Yes.
is one of the things, as much as we say, the acts and the rituals or the practices, the Islamic practices,
Mhm,
should not use the spirit. The core, I think the Sufis really stress that, what's the purpose of that action,
mhm,
what's the
mhm,
purpose of the ritual and the practices, the religious practices, to really breathe into that action, that proper spirit. I think that's really important, to embody
mhm,
faith in
mhm.
action. I think it's core to Islamic teaching. And I think, just like for those who are not familiar with Sufism in America, there are so many orders, tariqas,
Mhm.
spiritual orders in America. There's the Shazadi, you mentioned the Chishti order,
Yes.
and the Naqshbandiya, the Qadariya. So again, there are so many
Mhm,
branches just here
mhm.
in the country
Yes.
that people are not always
Yeah.
aware of. So
Right.
we'll take, yeah, sure,
Oh,
please.
yeah. Just a minor, but I think perhaps an insightful digression on Sufism being like the spirit embodied and spirituality in action, and not something distant and not something static. Um, in the course of my research, I've made 4 visits to Saran, this town where Noor and her family had lived, and in fact, where the family home still stands and where several members of the family still live. Um, and there's this elementary school there, which is named after Noor. I went there one day and I did about an hour-long interview with third graders. Why is your school named after Noor Inayat Khan? Who is Noor Inayat Khan? What have you learned from Noor Inayat Khan? What has she, in what manner has she influenced you? And when I asked the last one, how has she influenced you? How has she affected your life? Little kid right in front of me started waving his hand. I could not ignore him. Called on. He said, well, I learned that if my little sister falls into a hole, I'll pull her out. That's being of service to others. And I can't be
That's beautiful.
any more concrete than that, especially for a third grader in France.
That's wonderful to hear
So
how
let
her.
us all pull our sisters out of holes, and don't forget about the brothers while you're at it too. Thank you.
Yeah, I think, I mean, this is a beautiful, anecdote to share. I think her spiritual legacy really lives on. I want to take one more question from the audience, as it's located to related to our particular location. Jean Suda asked, did Noor have any relationship with Virginia Hall, also a spy for the British, who grew up in Baltimore County? And as a Baltimorean, proud Baltimorean, you can answer that, I'm sure.
I can answer it, and I'm going to give you a flat no. They never met. They never encountered each other. Yes, they both were secret agents, and they were both heroines, and they were both extraordinarily brave, and their bravery confounds me, and I wish I had just 1 ounce of that, but no, nothing to do with Virginia Hall. It'd be great if both of them had met each other. I could see them sitting outside a cafe in Paris. Oh, September 1943, German soldiers walking down the street, and the two of them confiding in each other, but nothing doing. So no.
You have spent so much time, with Noor Inayat Khan. Inayat, interesting, also means the help of God, which I think is such an appropriate name to have for Noor and her father. But you said, as we in our conversations, that Noor would have much to say about the fragile political and social climate that we are witnessing right now. What do you think she would have to say to us today, as somebody who spent so much time with her, writing about her?
Noor would not be content to sit on the sidelines of our culture, our society, any society. She would urge us to embrace the truth, as she called it, to embrace the truths all around us, to insist on truth from everybody, including our so-called leaders, our leaders elect and our leaders to be, and the leaders who are departing. Truth to her was paramount. Truth, as her father said, was all the religion there is. She would say, and I'm quoting, do not spare yourself in the work which you must accomplish. None of us can spare ourselves. In fact, you may remember a couple of months ago, there was that little kerfuffle, big kerfuffle, between two congressmen, Congress people. One was a man, the other was a woman. AOC was insulted by a Republican congressman. And the next day, in fact, I emailed her. I said, you are conducting yourself exactly how Noor Inayat Khan would. You are not sparing yourself in the work which you must accomplish. You are speaking truth, and you are speaking truth to power. And that, I told AOC, is what all of us must do. It is what Noor Inayat Khan did. And I prayed to AOC that will be how our society functions henceforth. Also, on explaining Noor, we're trying to come to terms with Noor. As I said before, I made 4 trips over to Suran. I spent some time in the house where Noor was raised. the house that she and her two brothers, sister, mother fled from in 1943. And on one of my visits, I interviewed Vilayat's wife, Mary. And this relates to exactly to what you were asking about, what Noor would say, and how we can live our lives now. I told Mary, who was then in her late 80s, almost 90, how do you explain Noor traveling internally from writing all these wonderful poems about fairies, about sympathizing with Mahatma Gandhi, about maybe planning to go to India and work with Gandhi after the war, about resisting, fighting as much as she could, and still insisting that she come to France in 43 and fight peacefully the Germans. How do you explain this, Mary? I said. And she said, because Noor always believed in the unbelievable. Noor always believed in the unbelievable. And that's what we can do now. Believe in the unbelievable. Believe in what we think is possible and darn well better be possible because it's right, because it mirrors this truth that Noor was so determined to advance and perpetuate and save. And indeed, even though she was killed at Dachau, she did save that truth.
Wow, there's these are just beautiful words, and nothing can be added on that. But before I turn it to over to my colleague Laura to close out the program, I want to get a final reflection from you. You said earlier that Noor changed you personally in so many ways. Could you maybe briefly share that with us, and then I will turn it to Laura.
Noor made me a better person. I wasn't a bad person before, let's get that straight, but Noor made me a better person. I think it's impossible to spend 5 years, I suppose, immersing yourself in a person like Noor without it being a beneficial influence on your life, on your spirit, on your soul. I think I'm more forgiving of other people. I think I'm more accepting of other people. I don't know, a year or two ago, somebody offended me slightly, and really a minor infraction.
Mm-hmm.
And I called them up and I said, I forgave them, I forgave them, I forgave them. And I did not cease my forgiving. And finally, this person said, no, I do forgive you. And I want you to know I'm forgiving you. And she said, why? Why are you doing this? I said, because Noors made me a better person. I was that upfront about it. Another time, being the arrogant person I am, somebody didn't do what I had suggested they should do, which I was sure was in their best interest. So for 2 or 3 days, I did not talk to her at all. And then I asked her to forgive me, because who am I to tell anybody else what to do? Mm. So I'm deeply indebted to Noor. And yes, I have finished the book, but I have not finished with Noor, nor do I believe she is finished with me.
Wow, thank you, Arthur, for these beautiful reflections, and make sure to get the book and read it and get inspired by Noor's spiritual legacy. I want to thank you, Arthur, for your time.